the fruit of a lifetime reflection on the prize puzzle of New Testament research. I am deeply appreciative of many aspects of Dale's work. Indeed, there are many helpful things that he has said, and I myself have cited him many times in my own publications. Nevertheless, because we are short of time, this presentation will focus on various problems with Dale's discussions of the alternative naturalistic hypothesis to Jesus' resurrection. Now, according to Allison, the purely historical evidence is not so good as to make disbelief unreasonable, and it is not so bad as to make faith untenable. So he thinks it's about 50-50, right? You can be rational believing, or you can be rational not to believe. Now, Dale himself chose to believe that Jesus resurrected, so he is a believer, right? But in his book, he also suggests various skeptical alternative hypotheses to Jesus' resurrection. And according to Allison, the best skeptical hypothesis is as follows. Okay, so the best thing that the skeptics can say is that, well, maybe some thieves stole Jesus' body. So after Jesus' body was stolen by thieves, Mary Magdalene hallucinated Jesus, as have others suffering grief, and likely triggered by Mary's claim. Something similar happened to Peter, and as for the interpretation, God raised Jesus from the dead. Jesus proleptically supplied death. He had prophesied death in the eschatological tribulation and vindication at the general resurrection, so it wouldn't be too difficult for his followers to imagine that the latest days have arrived, and that the resurrection of the dead has commenced, and all the more if Jesus seemed to Mary and or Peter to be not a ghost, but instead solidly veiled. Allison then argues that we do not have enough information to insist that James and Paul's experience could not have been subjective. As for the collective group appearances, Dale says, we can infer a few things about the appearance to the 12, as several texts likely descend from an early report of it. Yet who exactly saw what? This lies beyond us, as thus the reason for the note of doubt consistently associated with accounts of the meeting. As for the 500, our lack of knowledge similarly allows a skeptic to wave it away. Maybe mass pareidolia is the explanation, or perhaps it was a case of mass hysteria. Groups can, in any case, according to their own testimony, share visionary experiences. And so, in summary, according to Dale Allison, the best skeptic hypothesis involves a combination of the stolen body hypothesis, hallucination, mass hysteria, and mass pareidolia. Now, I have already refuted the stolen body hypothesis in my previous publication, in my book, Investigating the Resurrection of Jesus Christ, published by Routledge in 2020. And I don't have time to talk about it in this talk. So in this talk, I shall focus on Dale's discussion concerning the collective appearances, right? The combination of his discussion concerning parallel apparitions, hallucination, mass hysteria, mass pareidolia. And I shall show that the best skeptical alternative hypothesis actually does not work. Now, I want to clarify again that Dale is a believer, right? He himself doesn't believe in any of these skeptical hypotheses. However, the problem with his book is, when I read it, he leaves some objections hanging in the air, and even though he does not believe it himself, and sometimes he will explain the reason why he doesn't believe it. He will say, well, because of X, right? So he doesn't believe this. But then he will also say, well, maybe skeptics can also say they don't believe in Jesus' resurrection because of the same X, right? So if you don't want to believe this skeptical hypothesis, you can also use the same reason not to believe the resurrection as well. So as I said earlier on, his view is that he thinks it's 50-50, right? You can argue it both ways. And so you can be rational to believe, but you can also be rational not to believe. And so that is the main problem I have with his book, is this point. Not that he holds this skeptical hypothesis himself. I know that he doesn't, right? So I don't want to misrepresent him. Okay. But my objection to his view is that he leaves this thing 50-50, whereas I think that the case for Jesus' resurrection is much stronger than that. Okay, I don't think it's 50-50 either way. And so that's what I'm going to show in the rest of this talk. And I also want to say something about what Kurt Anderson said earlier on, that I think he was quoting some people who says that resurrection cannot be known except by faith. Now, I don't think that is accurate way to put it, I think there is very good reason and evidence to believe that Jesus resurrected, right? So it's not just by faith. And I think he also said earlier on that only believers saw the appearances. Now again, that's not true, right? We know that Paul wasn't a believer, neither was James, and the 11 disciples, they were so full of doubts after Jesus was crucified, right? So they have essentially became unbelievers in a sense, right? So all of them, many of them at least were unbelieving, right? But then they became convinced because of what they saw. So I want to say that the case for Jesus' resurrection is much stronger than what is presented in Dale's book. And there's a lot of issues to cover actually, because Dale's book covers a lot of issues related to, say, for example, research on memory, and also hallucination. And I don't have time in this short talk to cover all these issues, but I want to recommend the work of some people, and in fact some of them are here actually, right? So there's a very excellent book published recently by David Gregg. David, are you here? David? Yes, he's sitting at the back. Right? So he has published probably the best book on memory, right, and how it relates to Jesus' resurrection research. So I highly encourage you all to check out this book. You can talk to him afterwards. His book is also published by Routledge, a leading academic publisher. And also we have a psychologist here, Nick Metodă. Are you here? Nick? Yes, sitting there. Right? So he's one of my collaborators. Right? So he's a professional psychologist. Right? He's an expert in this area. So he has done a lot of research on how psychological hypotheses, whether they can explain away the resurrection or not, right? And he argues that they can't. So again, I will refer all of you to his work as well. Okay, so in this talk, I'm very short of time, so I'm going to just keep it focused on a few points. Okay? So the first thing I want to touch on is concerning, so in section 3 of my paper here, section 3, I'm going to refer to it again. I'm going to talk about what Dale says about parallel apparitions and cognitive and parallel apparitions. Okay? So Dale Allison argues that there are examples of apparitions of the dead which can be considered as, in some sense, parallel to Christ's resurrection. Now, I'm going to argue that they are not parallel. Okay. But anyway, he argues that there are a number of reports of group apparitions or visionary experiences. Now, however, one problem with his discussion of these reports is that these reports are taken from parapsychological literature. And these are of dubious authenticity. These are not peer-reviewed academic psychology literature. These are parapsychology literature, and they are not peer-reviewed, or they are not very rigorously reviewed. Right? I have looked at some of these myself. And in fact, there are a lot of cases which has been exposed as frauds, right? And also the problem of not being able to repeat some of these things. These are problems affecting all this literature actually. Now, in fact, Dale Allison himself also acknowledged that there are actually no well-authenticated cases of group much larger than 8 people. Okay, so at most he thinks there's about 8 people who saw something together, but not much more than that. And so it is actually disanalogous, right, to the case of Jesus' resurrection, where we have 12 and then 500 over people, right? So there's nothing like that in other literature. No well-authenticated cases. Now, even the authenticity of what Allison himself considered to be the strongest case of up to 8 people, I argue that they are dubious as well. Now, so for example, Dale Allison, he considered one of the strongest cases is a case concerning a guy called Samuel 𝐴. Okay? So this was seen by 8 people. Now, in 1932, Samuel 𝐴 died, and shortly afterwards, 𝐴's daughter, her husband, and their 5 children moved into 𝐴's dilapidated residence. So 𝐴 lived in a very poor house, and his relatives came in and helped to take care of 𝐴's aged wife, surviving him. And then they claim that on more than one occasion, the apparition of 𝐴, which appeared to be solid, appeared to them together at one and the same time. Now, however, the problem is that in this case, we only have 8 witnesses, and all of them belong to the same family. Right? It's not that, unlike Jesus' case, where there are various groups here and there. And in this case, it's all of the same family. And in fact, some people went to investigate this case, and the investigators' report does not rule out the possibility that these family members, they all belong to the same family, they could have colluded to make up the story, right, for various forms of perceived benefits, They are not just limited to housing benefits, right? They could have thought that by making up this story, they could have gained something from other people. So reports from parapsychological literature often depend heavily on witness statements from the general public who are simply allowed to tell their stories in their own way without any requirement to justify or explain their experience. And the parapsychologist is left to make what he will of the data received. Clearly, the way is open not only for conscious fraud, but of unconscious fraud too. Right? So there could be deception here. Indeed, there have been multiple documented cases of fraud in the parapsychology literature, and also in the psychology literature as well. Right? Even the peer-reviewed ones, sometimes there's also fraud cases, let alone the parapsychology. Now, on the other hand, what about the resurrection case? Is it likely a fraud? Now, Allison himself acknowledged that the fraud theory concerning the resurrection has long been discarded by scholars. And here, Allison himself cites E.P. Sanders, who has argued that, quote, "I do not regard deliberate fraud as a worthwhile explanation for the case concerning Jesus' resurrection, given that the disciples of Jesus were to spend the rest of their lives proclaiming that they had seen the risen Lord, and several of them would die for their cause." Now, this is not the case concerning Samuel Boo, right? So none of Boo's family members would have to undergo persecution or willing to die for what they claim. That's not true. But this is true for the case concerning Jesus' resurrection. Moreover, I have argued in my publications that for the disciples of Jesus to lie, to make up a story about such a fundamental matter concerning their faith will be inconsistent with their devotion to the one God of Israel. We must remember that the earliest Christians were Jews, and they were devout monotheistic Jews. And according to their Jewish monotheistic faith, to mislead people to believe that Jesus was truly divine by making up his resurrection will be guilty of idolatry, the most serious sin, right? And this will be condemned by the God of Israel. So no groups of people will be willing to die for what they know is false and go to hell for what they know is false. Right? That doesn't work at all. That cannot work. And moreover, it is in Dale's own argument against Rudolf Pesch's proposal that Easter faith was sufficiently explained by the disciples' pre-Easter belief. Okay, so Pesch, previously he suggested that maybe the disciples before Easter they had already believed in Jesus. Now Allison argued that Easter faith was in a large measure a response to the appearances of the risen Jesus. Okay, so it's, whatever pre-Easter faith they had, it's not sufficient to explain how the group of disciples eventually came to be convinced that Jesus resurrected and be willing to die for him. What is crucial here is the appearances. And the sources, however much they otherwise disagree, concur that something earth-shattering occurred. The disciples had an earth-shattering experience in the days immediately after the crucifixion. So what kind of earth-shattering events could have started the Easter faith and caused it to persist? Now, in Dale Allison, he discussed bereavement experience, and these are fairly common. In fact, I myself also have bereavement experience. When my own father passed away, I have a sense of his presence sometimes. However, I and the rest of my family members do not therefore believe that my father resurrected from the dead. I do not believe that his solid body resurrected. Why? Because this is much harder to believe compared to just sensing the presence of the deceased, which is quite common. And so in order for a group of people to believe that the dead body actually became alive again, right, and empty from his grave, came out alive again, I think there's much more solid evidence will be required, such as seeing, so if I were to believe that my father resurrected from the dead, bodily, I would probably need to have him coming to me and let me touch him and eat together with me and my family. That kind of evidence will probably be required. So likewise, I argue with other considerations that some solid evidence, such as the disciples seeing Jesus as a group, eating and drinking with him together, will likely have been necessary to start a widespread agreement among the earliest Christians that a resurrected corpse was what they witnessed, rather than just merely a spirit. And also for them to persist in holding to this belief as their foundational belief in the context of persecution. And indeed, we have in the Gospels narratives of the disciples claiming that Jesus did appear to them and eat and drink with the disciples. And these are multiply attested in first century documents. Okay, so we see this in Luke chapter 24, Acts chapter 1, and John chapter 20, which is independent. Oh, only found this? Okay, wow, going too slow. And these were written during the period of living memory, within the period within which these eyewitnesses were still alive. And their readers can verify and confirm that they were indeed these groups of people who claimed that they saw the resurrected Jesus, as well as the details of what they claimed to see. Additionally, despite the diversity and even apparent contradictions of some of the details, which are in fact evidence for multiple attestation, there are also common elements that are agreed upon in the appearance traditions, which spans a considerable portion of their diversity. And so these elements include resurrected Jesus having a meal with the disciples and speaking to groups of these people. And Allison himself have argued that it is very important to observe repeated patterns across various characteristics and sources, and to focus on the overall impression of the sources give in making historical claims of Jesus. And Allison has also argued that since the Christians in Corinth would not have believed based on the scanty information in 1 Corinthians 15 concerning what they saw, this 1 Corinthians 15 must have been a summary of traditional resurrection narratives which were told in fuller forms elsewhere. And N.T. Wright has argued that these fuller accounts would have been required to answer the question, why did Christianity begin? And because when the earliest Christians shared the gospel with others, their audience would want to know, right? What did you see, right? So they would want to know the details. And these details must have been told since the earliest days of Christianity. And their stories will have resulted in the formation of Christian communities. And stories for community forming as these, once told, are not easily modified, because these are foundational. Too much depends on these foundational stories. In other words, the resurrection narratives will not only have been investigated properly by the early Christian communities, but also preserved properly, given their importance. And so these details will have been repeatedly retold and well remembered. Just as residents of cities where there's an earthquake happen, those people who live in the area will have extremely good memories of the details of these events. And so what this means is that it's not easy to change the details once the stories are told. And I argue that these details will have been carefully preserved by early Christian communities and written down in the Gospels, as N.T. Wright also argues that the stories we find in the Gospels, they exhibit exactly the surface tension, apparent contradictions, which we associate not with tales artfully told by groups eager to sustain the fiction, but rather with the hurried, puzzled accounts of those who have seen with their own eyes something which took them horribly by surprise. And also there's also evidence of embarrassing details we find as well. Right? So given all these considerations, we have good historical evidence that Jesus was witnessed to be speaking to groups of people, eating in their presence, and was touched by them. And so this will rule out, I argue, hallucination hypothesis, and also hysteria, and also pareidolia as well. Do I still have time? Oh. Okay, keep going. Okay. All right. Now, and of course, I'm not a first scholar, but Gary Habermas and Bergeron have argued that collective hallucination hypothesis doesn't work. A collective hallucination, right? A collective hallucination will be like a group of people seeing Dale Allison here when in fact he's not here. You're here, right, Dale? Okay. Good. Yeah, you know that he's here because all of us are seeing him at the same time. So, and of course, this doesn't work. Now, however, Dale Allison, he objected that Habermas and Bergeron's argument appear to assume that the groups who saw Jesus behold exactly the same thing. But how can we know that they actually saw the same thing? Maybe they didn't see the same thing. Okay. Now, he argues that there are reports of doubts due to the disciples seeing different things. But I argue that those reports of doubts are more probably due to the fact that it's not easy to believe that the dead person was raised to life again. On the other hand, they must have, as I already argued, they must have seen something solid together in order for them to be convinced in the first place, such that they'll be willing to die for what they claim about Jesus' resurrection. Now, I still have a lot more points to cover, but I think because I'm short of time, I shall have to go quickly to my conclusion. Okay, so now let me also say something about hysteria, okay, before I conclude. Now, Allison also argues that if there's a high concentration of resurrection appearances in a very short time, and then drop off, this will match the patterns of many episodes of collective delusion, which is a kind of mass hysteria. However, Allison fails to note that the reason for the cessation of collective delusion, say for example, concerning Bigfoot, right? Some people used to believe that they saw Bigfoot, is that people stopped believing in it, because people realized that it was a delusion, and that's why they stopped believing in it. That's why there's a cessation, and the enthusiasm wanes, and this disappears. In other words, many victims of mass hysteria, and also of hallucination, they are able to achieve insight. They are able to realize later on that what they think they saw is actually not there, right? So they are able to realize that. But this is not the case concerning Jesus' resurrection, where we have these disciples, they persist in their belief and were willing to die for their faith. Now, I also argue that pareidolia doesn't work as well. Dale Allison briefly mentioned pareidolia, so he thinks that maybe for the primary people, they look up at the clouds, and this cloud looks maybe a little bit like Jesus, and they thought that that's the resurrected Jesus. Now, I argue that in context, 1 Corinthians 15 is actually writing to address some people who are skeptical of Jesus' resurrection. Paul said this in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 12. How come there are some of you here who don't believe in the resurrection? Well, because we need to understand that for the Corinthians, they were influenced by Greek philosophy, and it's very difficult for the Greeks to believe that a dead body can become alive again, right? And to tell these people to look at the clouds, I don't think it will work. I think it will also only make it even more implausible for them to believe, and I don't think Paul is so stupid to do that. And in any case, right, this doesn't explain the experience of the 12, right? As I argued earlier on, there's good evidence that Jesus actually appeared and spoke to the 12, but clouds cannot speak to people, right? Clouds cannot wave to people. Right? I mean, some clouds will appear to be good like Jesus, but then they can't wave back at you, right, if you wave to them. So a cloud is obviously not a body, right? And I think ancient people and modern people know that as well. Okay, so in conclusion, Dale Allison's work on Jesus' resurrection is magnificent in its scope, and the amount of literature it cites. Nevertheless, while he exemplifies a high degree of critical thinking in his analysis of the New Testament material, I think that his examination of the parapsychological literature, as well as his discussion on the best skeptical alternative, is not critical enough. In particular, his discussion of parallel apparitions, hallucination, mass hysteria, mass pareidolia overlook serious problems which render all these skeptical hypotheses unreasonable to accept. And therefore, it does not rebut the historical argument for the resurrection of Jesus, which I have defended in my publications. Okay, so I have a book called Investigating the Resurrection of Jesus Christ, I mentioned this earlier, and I have also a book published by Cambridge University Press, The Origin of Divine Christology, and another book called Studies on the Origin of Divine, the Development of Divine and Resurrection Christologies, and also an article which I co-authored with Nick Miller, published in the Journal for the Study of Historical Jesus. So in all these publications, I argue that there is good historical evidence which indicate that there were groups of people who claimed that they saw Jesus alive shortly after he was crucified. And these people did not make up the story. They clearly saw something, okay, such that they were willing to die for this faith and not be afraid that they will go to hell, right, for making up the story. And what they actually saw, so they saw something, and what they saw was not caused by something outside their mind. No, sorry, it was not caused by something inside their mind, but there was something outside their mind that they truly saw together, in groups. And this something was not another thing or another person, but it was Jesus himself, who was crucified earlier and died on the cross earlier, as Allison himself also believed, and was seen alive again later. And therefore, Jesus resurrected. He was dead, and he was alive again. Thank you.